So even The Guardian has picked up this story today. The new Director General of the BBC is to crack down on staff posting their views on social media in a move to restore the view of the broadcaster as impartial. And yesterday, he raised the question of slashing the corporation's output by a fifth, cutting more jobs and potentially shutting down TV channels. Well, listen, I'm all in favour of that. They've got 10 TV channels at the BBC, believe it or not. Let's find out now from James Price whether I am barking up the wrong tree, whether I'm just barking because I've now suddenly found myself in favour of the BBC's Director General. James, a very good morning to you.
Hi there, it's great to be here visa-free into your independent republic.
Welcome, you're absolutely right. We've spoken a couple of times before, James. Tell me, I'm quite surprised and slightly taken aback that this guy Tim Davie has become so aggressively anti-BBC in his first few days.
I know, well, as Diane Abbott would say, even a stopped clock is right 3 times a day. I think it's wonderful news to see that the BBC might be finally going back to its original founding charter, which we all apparently have forgotten, to inform, educate and entertain. It doesn't say anywhere in that founding charter that you should go on to Newsnight and go on kind of these long political screeds, or worse, to go onto Twitter and do it. Or in the case of Lewis Goodall, who I think you just mentioned, to get a front page splash on the New Statesman talking about how terrible the government is.
Yes.
It's enough to make a cat laugh.
Well, it really is. I mean, the beginning of the slide, I suppose, was the Real Britannia business at the beginning of this week, where he announced that they were going to not only play the Real Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory songs, but actually they were going to get somebody to sing it, which they previously told us they couldn't do because of the COVID epidemic.
I think it's almost like a perfect storm. I'm very glad that this kind of horrendous thing around the problems actually happened, because it's got such huge cut through to the normal people in this country of thinking, hang on a minute, maybe people like you and I going on about the BBC had a point, and they finally realised quite how far the rot is set in the place. And it's also coincided with Lord Hall, a man who I think joined the BBC in the 70s straight out of university and was there almost all the way through his whole career until a brief sojourn at the Royal Opera House before coming back to be the Director General, has left, and this new chap's come in, and it frankly seems like a breath of massive fresh air that's definitely needed.
Well, it really does. But I wonder, and Nick DeBras said this to me earlier, whether it's going to be actually effective, because there's going to be a challenge, I'm sure, coming from those who like to proselytise on social media, like Laura Kunsberg, although she's been quite quiet recently, people have noticed. Lewis Goodall is still out there. He was moaning and groaning about the possible introduction of a right-wing news channel, as was Nick Robinson, who was kind of entreating people the other day to make sure they wrote to Ofcom to stop this channel from ever getting underway.
You can't be allowed to have people think independent thoughts, right?
No, absolutely. Shocking.
I think that the rot is set quite deep and quite a long way. And I don't think until very recently, really, probably Brexit, that it's been at those top political levels. I actually think that Kunsberg is pretty good. I think she's probably about the best there is. But people like Goodall and Maitlis, they just can't seem to help themselves. I think that it's those times when MPs feel finally obliged to have to go and weigh into this with threats of legislation or changes to the licence fee model. I think more iniquitous are all these sorts of these social norms that get pushed around. So you had a lot of things like videos of how not to be a Karen in the wake of all this. What is, it's now basically just misogyny to go around calling people Karens if women like to complain about things. And all those sorts of social things, more than it is necessarily most of the time someone going on the radio and saying Tories are bad. It's all the rest of it and telling us what we ought to think, and that we're backwards in the rest of the country, not London, if we don't believe what people in the BBC think.
I mean, I don't mind being told Tories are bad on radio stations. I don't mind watching Question Time. What I object to is the fact that they pretend that all of this is completely normal behaviour. And in fact, the person who's telling you Tories are bad is not just somebody with a left-wing perspective. It's somebody who has studied the science almost, It's like they know the Tories are bad because look at what they've done. There's no possible other explanation for it. It's like the whole Tony Abbott hysteria that's going on at the moment, Oh my goodness me, somebody's actually got some conservative traditional values, therefore they must be the devil.
Right. I've got lots of colleagues who take a different stance to this, and they see these sorts of, I guess we'd have to call them culture war arguments coming up now, and feel compelled to defend the BBC because they have, the people who work there have a valid point of view and it should be debated. But that's exactly the problem. The BBC should be this kind of neutral arbiter. It shouldn't be weighing in on all these kinds of things. It shouldn't have to become a political issue. I'm not saying that you and Lawrence Fox need to take over presenting Bake Off, although
We probably do a pretty good job of it, to be honest.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Or Farage going and running Strictly Come Dancing or anything, right? You just want a level playing field with these things, especially, by the way, when you still got the threat of imprisonment if you don't pay this incredibly outdated license fee.
That's the other thing. I mean, Strictly Come Dancing, for me, is a commercial enterprise which should be produced by an outside broadcast company outside of the BBC. Let them make money or let them stand or fall by the commercial aspects of its success. But what I object to about the BBC, and I particularly find this objectionable in their local radio output, is that they completely stop anybody else from operating a commercial business in broadcast because they can't compete, because they don't have to make ends meet. They don't ever have to be profitable. They don't ever have to worry about the ratings. All they do is survive on this free cushion of money provided by us.
Absolutely. And you've hit the nail on it exactly right there. Any one of your listeners or people watching this live on YouTube, if they've seen that their local newspapers have gone from being daily to weekly, and now maybe even to only online, that's been massively hastened by the fact that the BBC has spread its tentacles all the way out across the country and does all these sorts of local news things. Regional radio suffers, as you say, local papers suffer. So I think we've now got to a situation where either the BBC has to move to a sort of subscription model and lets itself go and compete against Netflix and against everything else, or it gets massively trimmed back into just doing some of its core functions. And that's presenting news in a hopefully objective way, but also, to be fair, making really interesting programs that may not be commercially viable.
Yeah.
Strictly definitely is. There's all sorts of crap they used to have, like Can Fat Teens Hunt, right? Or any of those sorts of rubbish programs that you might find on some minor channel. But the BBC doesn't need to make that. It should make interesting and informative things, but it doesn't need to make all this kind of lowest common denominator stuff.
No.
It should focus on keeping the national conversation going.
Exactly right. And it needs to be far better run, because there's no doubt that Tim Davie's had a look at it. He's talking about getting rid of 900 people. He won't even touch the sides. I mean, it won't make any difference at all to the fact that there'll still be another 9,000 working in the same building from which the 900 have gone. And I mean, the number of times you go to an event, when I was a reporter back in the day, and you would find about 15 reporters from various different BBC outfits, and you'd be working for 3 newspapers, because that's the commercial world in which we live, and they just can't carry on like that. It's ridiculous.
No, I used to get it as a special advisor. You'd have multiple people from across the BBC would all text you asking about the same story.
Yeah.
And my old gaff at the Taxpayers Alliance used to have a lot of fun working out, just for the top stars, how many license fees Gary Lineker was worth, and it's astronomical.
Yes.
And that's before, by the way, some of the really cheeky ones who make themselves these sorts of private companies and then get paid off books and paid much, much more.
Right.
Again, Gary Lineker, I'm sure, can be paid an absolute fortune to talk about football on Sky or somewhere else. I don't quite understand why we're threatening old ladies with the threat of prison for not paying for his salary.
Well, believe it or not, guess what? He already does that, because somehow his incredibly lucrative contract with the BBC also allows him to go and work for BT Sport. So we're not even getting the best of both worlds. I actually think Gary Lineker is not a bad presenter, even though he's blocked me on Twitter, so I can't actually interact with him, because I once asked him whether he was paying any tax on his Walker's Crisp income. He didn't like answering that, apparently. But I mean, the bottom line for me...
Can't imagine why.
No, I know, it's ridiculous. But still, he's taking a refugee soon, so that'll be fine. But the bottom line is that will he adhere to this? Because of all of the people that we've talked about, including Emily Maitlis and Laura Kunsberg, all of the Amal Rajan as well has been pretty quiet apparently on Twitter. Lewis Goodall is probably a coward, so will probably buckle under. But the fact that that Lineker is quite full of himself, he may take the view that he's going to challenge this, right? And so he'll put out a tweet, and then it will be down to Tim Davie to see what he has to do about that.
Yeah, absolutely, and this kind of shake-up will always encourage that sort of challenge. And whether it's from someone like Gary Lineker who goes mouthing off, or whether it's if there's any real attempts at sort of structural change inside that building, how it will be frustrated. I think that TV show they do about themselves, W1A, is actually quite funny. But it's not enough to go, aren't we silly? Don't we waste lots of money in stupid, pointless meetings and then do nothing about it? Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
Well, one of my favourite illustrations of how useless the BBC is as an organisation for actual administration was when they moved everybody up to Salford, and Radio 5 Live had to sort of relocate up to Salford. They were bringing guests from London to Salford. On trains. They were putting guests up in hotels. So they actually, all of this moving out to the suburbs and the different parts of the country was completely and utterly pointless, because they ended up costing about 4 times as much.
Mike, I'm ashamed to say that I took one of those trains
I'm
once,
sure you
and
did.
I stayed in the hotel.
I'm
It was
sure you
perfectly
did.
lovely. I spent the next morning on BBC Breakfast and doing all the radio stations. It was great. And then someone got me a taxi back to the station, back to London. Who was sat next to me but one of the BBC Breakfast presenters?
Well, I can tell you exactly who that was because I know that story. And she used to come back to London every single day and take her child from school and then get back on another train, go back up there, stay the night in another hotel. I mean, it was just profligate. You'd never get away with it, even in the most kind of generous of private companies.
Maybe that's why the BBC is still so pro HS2, as it gets them back and forth towards Salford a bit more quickly.
Well, absolutely right. But I mean, in terms of the actual political end game here, I suppose. I mean, Boris Johnson hasn't made any great secret of his enmity with the BBC, and I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind that come 2027 there will not be a licence fee in the same manner as there is now.
No, I think that's right. And I think that a lot of being made of the way that Number 10 is sort of dealing its media relations, not just the BBC, but with Piers Morgan's breakfast show. Piers Morgan can't seem to understand why it is that ministers don't want to go on and be shouted at for 10 minutes at 6 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't sound that much fun to me either. I think that there is a big change coming. I mean, not to be too sycophantic, but talk radio is growing massively.
It is.
Because it's an alternative voice to these sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, it's also
in my old
because
job, I used to...
It's also because we actually listen to what ordinary people have got to say, because ordinary people, I think...
never catch on.
Ordinary people are sick to death of watching very, very well-paid presenters having a go at the people that run the government, rightly or wrongly, because they don't get a say in that. They don't get to say, well, what about us? What questions can we ask? Why aren't you asking the questions that we want you to ask instead of just shouting at them?
Well, exactly. In my old job, I sort of felt compelled to listen to the Today programme on BBC 4 in the morning because you'd think that was the thing that all the politicians listen to and the big journalists and all this sort of stuff. And then you get to a point where they start talking about some tiny, obscure issue of some metropolitan little museum somewhere or other that gets a footfall of about 10 people a month. And totally ignore huge issues that are going on anywhere else.
Yeah.
And it's
well,
ridiculous.
Do you know what's funny?
It's no wonder people are turning over.
One of the times when the Radio 4's Today programme was at its most relevant was when Rod Liddell was the editor of it. Now, Rod Liddell, as everybody knows, is now considered to be a sort of right-wing polemicist, writes a column in The Sun, a column in the Sunday Times, writes to The Spectator, very clever guy, quite right-wing, but was able to be the editor of a very, very straightforward news programme, and he did it very well, and there was no bias at all.
Right. And as much as I actually am warming to my own idea of you and Lawrence Fox running the Bake Off show, we're not asking for that, right? I think what most people would like to see is for politics to retreat from all areas of life.
Yeah.
It's become incredibly existential, mostly the reaction against the Brexit vote, and perhaps the fact that the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister was so terrifying, certainly to some people in our society, Jewish people in particular, who are thinking about fleeing the country. We're glad that that's not the case anymore. We're glad that Brexit's almost not an issue. Well, get over coronavirus too, and that will hopefully not be an issue. And then we can stop having to worry about politics all the time. But that's only really going to happen when we can stop worrying about the BBC politicising things.
But I really believe there is a kind of insidious left-wing kind of program where they're trying to make politics about life, where they're trying to make life about politics, where they're trying to basically say that, if your views are on the right, then clearly you're a bad person, you're a horrible individual, you're the sort of person that shouldn't be left alone with anybody who might be damaged by your terrible, terrible words, right? However, everybody who is on the left is great, and they're very, very sensitive, and they're very nice. I mean, I was hearing this conversation on a show the other day about whether somebody was sensitive or not. And it was all about whether women are better leaders than men because they're more sensitive. And it's like, what are you talking about? Why is sensitivity suddenly an issue for people being in politics?
Right. I mean, you can see, I think, over one of my ears, there's maybe a cushion with Mrs. Thatcher's face on it. I'm not sure she was worried about being sensitive. She was worried about doing a good job.
Exactly.
But it's not just the BBC, right? This kind of insidious creep of this way of thinking has infected most institutions. And it's because lefties have read their Gramsci, who talked about having the long march through the institutions, and have progressively taken over mostly universities, but you see it in the church, you're seeing it in the police, frankly, you're seeing it in all these sorts of august
civil
hallowed
service as well.
Completely. And I think it's time that there is a move against that. Again, not to make everybody a kind of mad free marketeer like I am, but just to have some level of balance and a level playing field to actually discuss the ideas. I'm sure there's even something I'm wrong about and that some lefty can help me get better with. Yeah. You need to be able to have that conversation.
But the point is the difference between the left and the right, it seems to me, is that the left want you to be like them. You quite like them not being like you. That's the difference, isn't it?
Yeah, I had a curry with a couple of mates last night. One of whom is, I think, planning on being a Labour MP one day. He's probably going to be called an awful Blairite or something at the moment.
Right.
But we had a lovely conversation. Some of it about politics. Then you move on and you talk about more important things like sport or something.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be everything in everybody's life all of the time anymore.
No, it really doesn't. James, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you very much indeed. Very enjoyable conversation. James Price, former government special advisor, now at Hanover Communications. The bottom line is, surely, the BBC is bloated. It's overfilled with people that shouldn't be there. It is certainly doing things that it shouldn't be doing. And I think this new guy, Tim Davie, actually might be onto something. I think he's discovered that actually let's be the voice of the people. They can't now be the voice of the people, of course, because that's what we are. We've taken that mantle and we are growing literally by the hour, never mind by the day. And the reason for that is because we let you give us your views and we care what your views are and we put them out there for you.